said. Things are hotting up. He laughs. Charlie sings some more. She caresses her corset and deftly drops her petticoat, revealing pink garters with little blue bows on. Harry is undone. She drops the petticoat onto his chest and starts to slip one of the garters off her leg. Harry is clearly aroused. He lifts the petticoat towards his face to do... what? To put it over his head so he can go back to sleep. Clearly he's impotent. Or gay. Or English. It's time to bring out the big guns. Charlie drapes herself around a four-poster pole, raises a knee, and pulls on a straw boater. And that does it. Forget the corsets, the frocks, the petticoats, the garters, the ribbons, the laces, even the red shoes, which I notice now she still has on. It's the straw boater that finally seals the deal for Harry. And clearly for me, because now, after all this song and dance hanky-panky, we finally get the other bit of the scene which I remember, the bit in which the woman walks away from the man, apparently done troubling him, at which point the man, who up until now has been so reticent to get involved, calls her back by reaching out and catching hold of the lace which trails behind her. Only that's not what happens. Not quite. Clearly, I've transposed the bit with the lace from earlier in the scene when he was whipping off her skirt, with her consent, of course. By now, however, Harry has clearly gotten off his horse and drunk his milk and is in no mood for namby-pamby niceties. No siree, Bob. Now that his bloodlust has been inflamed by that damn straw boater, it's time for manly action. So, as Charlie turns to walk away in something approaching an unsatisfied strop, Harry reaches out and grabs her by the wrist and hauls her giggling with gaiety onto the bed, where the happy couple are finally conjoined in 3 seconds of laughter-filled canoodling, climaxing in him patting her once again on the bum. Cut to the engine room, and a shot of huge pistons pounding in and out, up and down, in an orgy of mechanical thrusting and pumping. Really? I stop the DVD and take stock. All said, it's pretty depressing. There was I, imagining that my young mind had somehow latched onto something profoundly Freudian and symbolic, something which would have suggested a deeper appreciation of the mysteries of the adult world than befitted a 6-year-old boy, something which proved that even at an early age my eyes were looking beyond the screen to the story behind the picture. The truth is far more mundane. At an early age, I watched Barbara Worrell stripping down to her corset and petticoat and showing off her garters, and clearly I have never got over the impenetrable longings which that experience provoked. This is emblematic of so much of my early life, and the sooner I face up to the fact that my entire adolescent worldview was informed by the fairground thrills of exploitation cinema, the better. In my formative years, everything I knew about politics I had learned from Planet of the Apes. Everything I knew about pop music I'd learned from Slade in Flame. Everything I knew about heartbreak I'd learned from Jeremy. Everything I knew about religion I'd learned from The Exorcist. And apparently, everything I knew about adult matters I'd learned from Krakatoa, east of Java. And you thought you were messed up. Chapter 2. Bright Lights, Big City Life. Just as watching movies defined my childhood, so writing about cinema became an early obsession. At around the age of 9 or 10, I brashly embarked upon an unauthorized novelization of 2001: A Space Odyssey, not realizing that Arthur C. Clarke had beaten me to it, cramming my own messed-up memories of the entire movie into 4 badly typed pages, for which I then constructed a hardback cover using cardboard and sellotape. I don't have a copy of that magnum opus anymore, but I remember that it didn't make much sense, although you could say the same of Kubrick's movie, but not, crucially, of Clarke's novel. From here I graduated to compiling books of film reviews, which I would then place casually upon bookshelves around the house in the forlorn belief that someone would start reading them without noticing that they were homemade. It wasn't until my teenage years, however, that my written work became available outside of my own home, and like so many wannabe journalists in the 70s and 80s, the first thing I ever wrote that actually got published was a schoolboy letter in the New Musical Express. Although it was nearly 30 years ago, I can still remember clearly the substance of the letter, which took the form of a short play. I was a pretentious arse even back then. This Beckettian gem, which was essentially a rip-off of the surreal ramblings of genius cartoonist Ray Lowry, took the form of an argument between two of the NME's most flamboyant and therefore greatest writers, Paul Morley and Ian Penman. If memory serves, these two journalistic behemoths were portrayed as squabbling in fluent lavatorial goon show gibberish before the fey arrival of Japan frontman David Sylvian, who announced simply, "I have no makeup," and then died. At which point, the entire NME cast turned up dressed as Monty Smith's stomach to sing an enthusiastic roundelay of "Show Me the Way Up My Own Bum." And they say satire is dead. The worst thing about this hideously smug and faux anarchic missive was the fact that I had clearly thought about it for a long time before sending it, hence my word-perfect recall almost 3 decades later. I can't remember a single line of Shakespeare, Milton, Keats, or any of the other immortal poets and playwrights whose wonderful works I studied at O-level, A-level, and university. But can I remember every sodding word of a stupid letter I sent to the NME back in the late 70s? Of course I can. I've got a head so full of junk there's no space left for the good stuff to go. Equally shameful is the amount of effort I expended attempting to appear utterly off the cuff and hilariously flippant. Plus, the entire satirical aim of the piece was clearly not to mock the writers in question at all, but to appear somehow in on the gag in a way which would make me appear to be one of them. People ask me nowadays why I'm so vitriolic about anything which could be described as vaguely quirky or madcap. And the honest truth is that I cannot forgive any sin in which I am so deeply steeped. I signed that letter Henry P., which was an obscure reference to my favourite band of the time, Yachts, whose frontman Henry Priestman I idolised. By a peculiar twist of fate, that name stuck, thanks to the mocking derision of my very close friend Simon Booth, who saw the letter and knew at once that it was from me. Sometime later I would move to Manchester, where nobody knew me, and where the university was awash with people called Mark. So, for the first few weeks of the academic term, people would politely ask my name, and I would reply, Mark, and they would instantly forget, because they already had 50 other Marks backed up in their "which one are you?" cranial databanks. Then, sometime around week 3, Booth came up to visit me in Manchester, and was overheard to refer to me as Henry, of which there were few others. So the name stuck. And for the rest of my 6 years in Manchester, I was known almost interchangeably as Mark, or Henry, or even occasionally Mark Henry, which sounded like some moonshine-drinking dungareed mountain dweller from the Waltons. After a while I got used to it and convinced myself that I had acquired the Henry nickname after Jack Nance's generously bequeathed screen icon in the cult movie Eraserhead, more of which later. Getting into Manchester University had proved something of a slog because I was not much cop at school and had unimpressive grades to prove it. In fact, on my first UCA form, now known as UCAS, I believe, I got 5 flat rejections, being turned down by everyone, including my surefire safety net 5th choice, which the good folk at Careers Advice assured me never rejected anyone. I didn't just get rejected, they asked to see me in person before deciding that I was not the sort of chap they wanted cluttering up their esteemed seat of learning. This was an important life lesson, because it taught me that if someone isn't sure that they want me to do something, whatever it may be, then actually meeting me will merely confirm their worst fears. To this day, I have never got any job for which I have had to be formally interviewed or do an audition. Never. Ever. I think that says a lot about how charming I am in person. Anyway, after a brief and foolhardy flirtation with the entrance examiners for Mansfield College, Oxford, who also told me to get lost, but in a very nice and affirmative way, I was apparently their top rejection, I applied again to Manchester and finally got in, which was great because it was the only place I really wanted to go, having read all about it in the NME. On my first day there, I trotted down to the Hacienda Club, brainchild of factory supremo Tony Wilson, and obtained my beautiful yellow and silver constructivist-style designer credit card membership ID. These cards are apparently now valuable collector's items, and I'd happily sell mine on eBay, were it not for the fact that I cut it up to make plectrums after falling upon hard times during an intense rehearsal schedule with my never-to-be-famous band Russians Eat Bambi. No one else has ever heard of them either. Like Hunter S. Thompson's San Francisco in the mid-60s, Manchester in the mid-80s was a very special time and place to be a part of, whatever it meant. Part of what being in Manchester meant was getting caught up in the heady tide of hard-left student politics which swept along the Oxford Road and guaranteed that at any time of day or night your passage could be impeded by balaclava-clad protesters demanding equal rights for Latvian yoghurt farmers, angrily stamping on Nestlé chocolate bars and threatening to burn down Barclays Bank. Along with its fashionably industrial music scene, Manchester was the UK's premier hotbed of sub-trot NUS militancy. No wonder the New Statesman dubbed it the crucible in which a generation learned its politics and went on to become the heart of New Labour. Today, people still talk of the role of the Manchester Mafia within modern politics, since so many of those who were radical young Turks in the 80s grew up to be rather less radical old farts in the 90s and noughties, helping to put Blair and Brown in power. Hey, thanks for that. As for me, I was always going to be a sucker for revolutionary politics because I'd spent so much time watching Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. So, with my usual flair for moderation in all things, I mutated during my time in Manchester from snot-nosed NME-reading angsty teenager to red-flag-waving bolshy bore with a subscription to fight racism, fight imperialism, and no sense of humour. I also developed an addiction to stern gender politics, which made me both unfunny and unattractive, a real double whammy. Whilst many of my more well-adjusted peers were taking drugs, having sex, and experimenting with new and exciting forms of liver abuse, my student years were defined by a profound belief that a hard rain was indeed going to fall, and this was no time to be enjoying oneself. In the words of Withnell and I's prophetic guru, Presuming Ed, we had spectacularly failed to paint it black, and there were going to be a lot of casualties. In my defence, I'd like to say that you'd have to have been a fully paid-up piece of pond life not to have got the impression that something was profoundly wrong with Britain in the mid-80s. The evidence of impending Bastille-storming upheaval was everywhere, and nowhere more so than in Manchester. When the Home Secretary Leon Britton visited Manchester University's Students' Union in 1985, 32 people were arrested and others injured as the police battled protesters blocking the entrance to the building. The resulting debacle made the national news and seemed to us to represent a throwing down of the gauntlet by Manchester Police's then Chief Constable James Anderton, a man who was famously on first-name terms with the Almighty. Unaffectionately nicknamed God's Copper, Anderton made headlines at the height of the AIDS panic with comments about people swirling about in a human cesspit of their own making, comments which helped turn him into a near-mythical bogeyman for those of a liberal persuasion. Indeed, anyone drifting even idly toward the radical left needed only to take a cursory glance at Anderton's more outrageous outpourings to spur them on to man the barricades forthwith. In my case, the barricades were a series of anti-deportation campaigns which centred around Viraj Mendis, a Sri Lankan activist whom the government were attempting to repatriate despite well-supported claims that he would be persecuted for his political beliefs — he was a passionate advocate of the Tamil Tigers — if sent back to his country of origin. Viraj had a lot of support in Manchester, where he had lived for several years, and his campaign to stay in the UK grew in size, importance and popularity throughout the 80s, becoming the focus of numerous similar anti-deportation battles. In December 1986, things cranked up a gear when Viraj went into sanctuary in Hume's Church of the Ascension after a deportation order was issued against him by the Home Office. He stayed there for 760 days, publicly defying the authorities, who finally ordered the police to batter down the doors of the church and forcibly remove him in the early hours of 18th of January 1989. During the years of Viraj's voluntary incarceration, his support team, the Viraj Mendis Defence Campaign, of which I was an active member, fought and won a number of other anti-deportation campaigns while simultaneously maintaining a 24-hour vigil at the Church of the Ascension. Once a week, each of us would get to stay up all night in the dingy foyer of that church, discussing the inevitable decline of capitalism, thus combining my two favourite obsessions, religion and politics, with Viraj's comrades in the Revolutionary Communist Group, not to be confused with their sworn rivals, the Revolutionary Communist Party, or indeed the Judean People's Popular Front, and in my case, writing rude and satirical songs about James Anderton. Here, for the record, is a sample of my best effort in that area. James Anderton is big and strong. James Anderton is in this song. James Anderton, his friends call him Jim. How truly wonderful